Hey guys, it's Bree here with Blossom and Branch Farm, and the farm is absolutely exploding with growth. You can see how green and vibrant everything is looking. But I also wanted to show you today how to be successful with direct seeding, because if you're like me, sometimes you plant things and maybe they're not successful or they die off, and then you have gaps in your garden that you need to fill in. You try direct seeding, but not always successful. So I'm going to give you my #1 tip today in this video for success with direct seeding, and that includes both our annuals that we planted here ahead of our last frost date that were cold tolerant and are now getting ready to bloom, and also some perennials. We're going to take a look at kind of what's blooming here at the farm. We're also going to take a look at some of the things that I like to direct seed, some of the seeds you can have the best success with direct seeding. This season, we're proud to partner with Advancing Eco Agriculture, providing regenerative solutions for growers, and greencoverseed.com. All right, first let's go and take a look at where I'm going to be direct seeding and kind of what's happening here at the farm. First, let's take a look at how some of the things I've transplanted in are performing here. In this row, we've got our Zenyas. Now, these are all things that went out way before last frost, because we are just about maybe 2 weeks past our last frost date here. If I had waited until after that date, these things would have been a lot smaller. But because we grow a lot of cold tolerant things, here we've got all of our Zenyas. Our perennials are coming up. These are our earliest bloomers here. We have our Baptisia. These ones are so pretty. I love these. Typically they're this kind of dark blue color, but we also have this beautiful pink variety called Pink Lemonade, and you can see there's a beautiful huge queen bumblebee enjoying these. These are very popular with the bumblebees, again, because they're a native. So lots of those coming in. All the peonies are obviously coming in. But in terms of the annuals, we've got our chamomile here is one of our first bloomers. Our snapdragons are doing quite well. These ones are getting close to being ready to flower, actually. I actually need to get some netting up on those guys. And then over here we've got some feverfew is getting ready to send up shoots. Here's our straw flower, which is also cold tolerant, our carnations, and some more snaps down here. Now, we've also planted out things like foxglove, sweet peas, stock. A lot of those cold tolerant things, again, have already been in the ground. But because we are just now at our coming up to, just after our last frost date, now is when I start to direct seed. So down on this row here, you can see our overwinter dahlias, and they are coming up quite quickly. Again, here we are. I mentioned we're about 2 weeks past our average last frost date here, and they do still have quite a bit of leaf mulch here on top. I do overwinter them in the leaves, and then we remove them toward our last frost date so that these can sprout and green up. You can see all these leaves are still here in this walkway. Probably need to kind of clear those out a little bit, but I do have a couple gaps. You can see where maybe a couple of the dahlias were either exposed to too much moisture or just didn't survive the winter, and so there's some gaps there. And then in our other dahlia row, we had such a dry winter that what happened was one of our tarps blew off, and we ended up losing a lot in that row. We also have blooming our salvia. The salvia, one of the earliest bloomers here, and I love the deep, rich purples of this one. Geum is another one that likes to bloom early. We have some of our Rocky Mountain penstemon just getting ready here to sprout, so those ones are also getting ready to burst into bloom. And we have our geum over here. Geum is a really cool plant, and it's not one that I see often in folks' gardens, but a really pretty color, and a lot of them have this kind of multicolor. Really pretty flower. They do get nice and tall, especially if they get enough moisture. And of course, all of our peonies are either blooming or getting ready to bloom. So we have our peony workshops coming up here in the next couple of weeks. We'll be using those for. But today what I want to show you is how I direct seed successfully. So we're right here in the row actually where I've direct seeded our zinnias. So I'm going to use this as my example because zinnias are a staple flower for me here at the farm. Zinnias can be very, very easy to grow, especially if you are just getting into cut flowers, because they are so easy to direct seed and they really prefer being direct seeded. So yes, you can start them inside. I know that people have success with that, but you tend to get more double blooms, the ones with lots of ruffles on them, if you can actually start them directly in the ground and not give them transplant shock, which often happens with those zinnias, because again, they are one that doesn't really like to be transplanted. So by direct seeding them into the ground, we get more ruffled blooms. They tend to be a little bit more resilient to things like transplant shock, and they don't get as offended if you get some wind, you know, some extreme sun, some weather variables. Just those direct seeded ones usually are a little bit more hardy. But the problem that I always hear is either they didn't come up or something ate them. So how do I deal with that here at the farm? My farmhand and I have gotten so good at planting zinnias that by now we really don't need to use spacers. But I do have a spacer tool. It's just a big plywood sheet that does exactly 6-inch spacing or 9-inch spacing or 1-foot spacing. Typically for me, for zinnias, I like to do a 6 to 9-inch spacing at the most. I find they don't need a lot more than that, and 1 foot is usually too much, at least here for me in my zone. So when I'm spacing my zinnias, usually what I do is I do the tip of my finger to the bottom of my hand. So when I'm laying my hand on the soil, so you can see here I have 2 seedlings that have come up, and what we do is as we're seeding, we can just kind of do, here's our hand, and you can see I've got tip of finger to bottom of palm, and that's about the spacing that I typically do for these zinnias. Now the other thing that you'll notice is that we typically have more than 1 seed in any given hole. So here you can see we've seeded 2 in, and both have luckily sprouted. Here we seeded 2, both have sprouted. Here we seeded 2 and 1 has been nibbled. So this is why I like to seed 2 or 3 even in each hole, because sometimes what will happen is one either gets eaten or only one will germinate. Because direct seeding in the way that we do, where we're being very specific with spacing, because it's a little bit more time consuming, I don't want to have to go back in and redo it. That's why we usually do 2 or 3 seeds in each hole instead of just 1. Seeding a little bit more than you think you need to. Don't just do 1 seed in each hole, do at least 2, if not 3 or even 4. Now, some of this depends on the germination rate. If it's an older seed or a seed that has a lower germination rate, say 85, 80% or below, then maybe you want to do at least 3 seeds. These zinnias have a 95% germination rate, so in that case, 2 should be plenty. But again, if you know you have a lot of nibbling, either mice or bunnies hopping around, then you might want to do more than that. But I have another tip for that case. Now, the other way that we sometimes direct sow is in a furrow. So versus where we're doing spacing, where I'm saying, okay, here's a hole, here's a hole, here's a hole, I'm using my hand. Sometimes what we'll do is I'll just take my hand or a tool and I'll just go right along next to my drip line of my irrigation system, and I'll just make a furrow all the way along, and then I'll sprinkle my seeds directly into that furrow. When I'll do that is when they are smaller seeds, say carrots or lettuces, or seeds that I have a lot of and I'm not super worried about making them stretch very far. So when I do this with my floret zinnia seeds, for example, those are very precious. I only have a few of them, and I don't want to just sprinkle those into a furrow. I want to be very specific. If I have a lot of the seeds, then maybe I'll just do it into a furrow, and then I can come back through and thin them later. So you either put in the time up front to space carefully, or you're going to have to put in the time later to do some thinning. Now with these zinnias, where I had more than 2 come up, I will thin those, so I'll remove one of those seedlings. But usually I wait to do that until a little bit bigger. So I would remove one of these seedlings just by pinching off the top like so. But I'm going to wait to select one of these until they're a little bit bigger, and I'll tell you why. It's because when they're still at this 1 leaf stage, they are still subject to things like cutworms and bunnies that might eat them. So this is kind of a way to try to help ensure that we are able to hold on to some of our zinnia seedlings even if we have nibblers. Depth is another important one, and this is one where it really depends on the seed. So certain seeds like to be surface sown, others like to be covered. It really does depend on the seed, but for most things that we're direct seeding, they're usually going to want a little sprinkle of soil over the top. Lots of different ways that you can do this. One is that you can just make your little hole, you can drop your seed in, and you can cover it to the depth stated on the packet. Give it a little press to make sure there's good contact with the soil. Now that's probably not new information for you. That's probably how you've done it before. You could also come in and sprinkle along the top a little bit of worm castings if you'd prefer to use those. And then again, I always do like to inoculate my seeds, even when I'm direct seeding them. Actually, especially when I'm direct seeding them, I like to give them an inoculation with a mycorrhiza or a dry powder inoculant like one from Advancing Eco Agriculture, which I'll link down at the bottom of this page. That just helps give them that microbiome that is really going to help them make associations with the soil from germination stage. So right off the bat, they're going to start forming those fungal and bacterial associations, which are so important for the soil. So a little bit of powder on the seed, rub it in, drop that seed into the hole, or you can drop your seed into the hole and put a pinch of inoculant into the hole after you seeded. But what's my number one tip? My number one thing that helps with direct sowing success. I'm going to show you. It's such a simple tip, but it really, really goes a long way. I do it for things like our zinnias, our cosmos, our sunflowers, really anything that I'm direct seeding. And that's because of two things. One is that spring can be inconsistent with moisture levels. Sometimes we get rain, oftentimes we don't. And so I like to do a nice water over the top after I've seeded, but then if I don't get rain, you know, I'll run my drip system, but it doesn't always do a nice surface water like I want for germinating seeds. That drip irrigation is better for deep watering, not so much for surface. And I don't want to be out here watering all the time. So this is what I do. I have a sheet of burlap, and this is a 3-foot width, so it's as wide as my beds. And after we seed, we come along, and we do have staples to staple this down just because we do have a windy zone. And I cover up the area that I've seeded with this burlap. This does a couple different things. One is it helps keep the soil moisture in. So like I mentioned, pretty dry here in Colorado, very inconsistent water. So yes, it helps to hold in the moisture. That's what the burlap is there for. But it also will help with things like wind erosion. So if we get a big windstorm in the spring, which we often do, this will help keep those seeds and the topsoil from blowing away, because we did just loosen it a little bit to get those seeds planted. That will help keep the erosion down. But the other big thing is that it helps protect from nibblers. So we have a lot of bunnies, we have a lot of mice, we have a lot of birds that like to scratch around in here. And so that will often disturb our direct seeds. So by putting this burlap over the top, we're able to protect from those things. Now, you might have things like cutworms or slugs that might like it underneath this burlap. And in that case, you could set a couple beer traps in here, or you could try mulching around the perimeter of your direct seeded area with some wool. Wool is a great natural slug deterrent, so you could try that as well. But in general, because we're overseeding a little bit, I find that even though we have lots of roly-polies, we have lots of earwigs, it's really not an issue because we're overseeding. I do leave it down, and the reason that I use burlap instead of frost fabric is because frost fabric is actually plastic typically. It's a polyester fabric, and I don't like that leaching into soil. Studies have found that a lot of that does leach into soil. So instead I've been using this burlap, which you can see is somewhat transparent. It's enough to keep those bunnies and mice out, but it's also letting the sun through. And that is nice because we can leave this on until we have our 2-leaf stage. So you don't have to take this off right after they've germinated. I'm actually gonna leave this on. I'm gonna restake it back down and keep it in place because again, it's going to help things germinate. It's gonna help keep the moisture in the soil. It's gonna protect these until they're a little bit bigger, and it's still letting sunlight through. So lots of pros to using a burlap sheet like this. All right, let's go talk about some things that I'm gonna use to direct seed into these gaps in my garden. There are lots of vegetables that you can direct seed. So things like snap peas, squashes, pumpkins, cucumbers, carrots, lettuce, beans. Those things all prefer to be direct sown. So yes, you can start them inside. Corn is another one that yes, you could start inside, but really they're gonna do better if you just direct sow them into the garden. I think a lot of you guys are on my channel because I do a lot of flowers, so let's talk about those specifically. The number one that I always direct seed, that do better when I direct seed them, and also are just one of my favorite flowers, are the zinnia. Zinnias come in so many different colors. My favorite by far are the Queenie series, and I'm also trialing a lot of the new Johnny series this year. They have been breeding some, so they have some called Ballerina, Aurora, Agave, some different varietals. So I'm trialing those. I'll be back to let you know how they do. But the Queenie limes are my other favorite. So I do like to always do a lot of those Queenie reds, Queenie peach, Queenie lime with blush. Those tend to be my favorites. If you just have a small little patch, just get the Queenie mix, and that will give you lots of different colors that will all kind of go together. So that's my number one. I also do like to do cosmos. Now, I'm not a huge cosmo fan because I do find they tend to reseed on me. I usually don't get to them. The vase life is a little bit on the shorter side for me. So they're not my favorite for direct seeding, but if you have some holes in your garden and you want to do a few cosmos, then you can. Just don't go overboard because it's really easy for your cosmos to get out of hand. That would be my number one tip on those. Sunflowers are another one that I always direct seed. Sunflowers are great. Again, really prefer direct seeding these ones. These are actually from Sunflower Steve, who breeds lots of really cool sunflowers. So I'm really excited for these. Every year the mice eat these, and because I don't do the burlap over the top. This year I am doing the burlap. I'm getting sunflowers this year. Every year I've gotten Sunflower Steve seeds, and I've only gotten like 2 sunflowers because they just never make it for me. Chamomile is another good and easy one to direct sow. Now these ones tend to kind of peter out toward me after it gets a little bit hot, but good for the cool season. And of course you can save the flowers and make them into tea as well. Calendula is a go-to. I've shown our calendula salve. These are seeds that I've saved. Very, very easy to save seeds from calendula. They look like these little kind of worms. So they will reseed in your garden if you don't get the seeds in time, so just keep that in mind. Marigold is another one that you can direct seed. They prefer warm soils. You could start these ones inside as well, but again, if you're looking for something, you can direct seed. You can do marigolds, all different varieties. Basil is another good one. Here we've got a cardinal basil. Basils all do different color blooms. This one's a little bit red, which isn't my favorite, but lots of basils, like cinnamon basil is a great one. That's kind of a darker purple and puts off a beautiful shoot and puts off a beautiful spike flower. Basil can be direct seeded. I also have always really liked using fennel as a cut flower. Fennel you can direct seed as well, but just be careful. It will reseed itself all over your garden, and dill will too. So if they're a good direct seed, they're probably gonna reseed themselves into your garden. You know what I'm saying? So just keep them cut, keep them deadheaded. That's true for all of these. So those are kind of my top for direct seeding. Zinnias, cosmos, chamomile, sunflowers, basil, calendula, marigolds. Those are some of my top picks. So if, again, you have some gaps in your garden and you're like panicking because there's nothing in there, go grab some of those seeds, pop them in. The zinnias, if you are looking for something that's not gonna get too tall, look for a shorter varietal, like a dwarf zinnia, to fill in those gaps around your other plants, because they're going to be small and they'll also attract lots of beneficials to your garden, but they won't outcompete for sunlight with other things in your garden. That's it for me today. This week I have just all the things happening. So much going on. Trying to be more consistent about updating here on YouTube. And let me know what you guys want to see in the coming weeks. All right, I'll see you guys around here next time at the farm.